There are also critiques of his methods. He used a type of rat called Sprague-Dawley rats, which critiquers noted are prone to developing spontaneous tumors. If you take 200 of these rats and divide them into 20 groups of 10 rats per group, you're likely to get very high tumor rates in some of the groups just by chance. The fact that clusters of tumors didn't show up in the control groups could be due to random chance. Also, the fact that there were only 10 rats per group was a problem because you should have more animals per group, and having only 2 control groups is also problematic. You should have many more than 2 control groups if there's only 10 rats in each group. The study found that rats eating a diet of 33% GMO corn stayed healthier than animals eating food with a concentration of 11%. So you would think that the rats that were eating 11% GMOs would have a lower incidence of cancer and tumors than rats with 33%. So that didn't make very much sense. And finally, no other scientists have found results like this. There are many different ways that the scientific process can be tainted, and you want to make sure that scientific results are reproducible by many different scientists before you accept one study. You can't base policy off of one study. So there are no other studies showing this. Still, many people cite this study as evidence that GMOs are bad for human health and may cause cancer. And a lot of this is propaganda, and a lot of this propaganda is based on unsubstantiated facts and sort of an exaggeration and a twisting of the evidence. These photos are some of my favorite anti-GMO propaganda, and it's generating fear, and they're not relying on good evidence. So are somewhat unintelligent and not based in reality. Still, many people are concerned that there are no long-term studies. We can sort of think of the people who live in North America as a long-term study because we've been eating genetically modified food for the past 15 years, hundreds of millions of us, and it hasn't made us any sicker as a result. But we only have 15 years under our belt, and a lot of people need more time than that to feel comfortable and feel confident that GMOs are not going to cause health problems. So that was an overview of potential human health effects. And now I'm going to talk about environmental effects. So many people are concerned that GMOs are not environmentally sustainable. GM crops are planted as monocrops. So this is a canola field, and you can see that there is little else in this field besides canola, and it just goes on and on and on. And all of these plants, these canola plants, are very similar. They're of the same species. They don't have a lot of genetic variety. So in the event that a pest that is not affected by these pesticides comes along, and if it can affect the canola plants, it could wipe out this entire field of canola plants because they're all so similar to each other and they're all susceptible to a danger in the same way. Also, monocrops deplete the soil of nutrients. So planting the same thing in the same fields over and over again removes certain nutrients from the soil, and you need to add fertilizers to the soil to make the plants grow every single season because things aren't decomposing in the soil, you're not rotating crops as much, you're not letting fields lay fallow, you're planting the same crops in the same fields with GM foods and crops. Also, the production of these herbicides and pesticides and fertilizers in factories and the transportation of all of those chemicals to each farm and their application by airplanes or tractors uses a whole lot of energy and releases a lot of carbon into the atmosphere. So it's contributing to global warming, it's contributing to rising levels of CO2 in the atmosphere in ways that something like organic farming is not contributing as much carbon to the atmosphere. And finally, if you're making plants toxic to insects who want to eat them, you're taking out a part of the food web. And this is a food web, and you can see that herbivorous insects are a very important part of that food web. And you don't want to wipe out herbivorous insects, because then you're wiping out a food supply for spiders and predaceous insects and insectivorous birds. So you're limiting by limiting herbivorous insects, you're also limiting the organisms that fall above them in the food chain who want to eat them. So that was a quick overview of the reasons that people are concerned that GM foods are environmentally unsustainable. And finally, we're going to talk about compromised food sovereignty. So food sovereignty is the right of people to define their own food systems. The people who produce, distribute, and consume food should be at the center of the decisions on food systems and policies. And while we all consume food, the representatives of certain corporations, like these 5 major corporations in this diagram, Monsanto, DuPont, Syngenta, Bayer, and Dow, they have a much bigger voice than the average person when it comes to our food supply. And this is a diagram of the seed industry structure from 1996 to 2008. And you can see how all of these small companies have been bought up by larger companies until they form these conglomerates, and they aren't independent anymore. They fall under these 5 major companies. And that's where almost every single seed that gets planted comes from. And then you need to talk about food sovereignty in terms of farmers who are working under contracts. Now, Monsanto and these other large companies don't necessarily own lots of farms, but they don't need to own farms to control what happens on farms. Farmers enter into these contracts with these large companies, and the contracts specify what needs to be grown, what quality should be grown. Sometimes they even specify exactly what farming methods, when the chemicals, how often the chemicals need to be applied, what kinds of equipment the farmer must use for planting and harvesting and herbicide application. So even though these farms aren't owned by these large companies, they're still owned by the farmer himself or herself. They still need to meet the company's demands in order to stay in business. So they don't need to own the farms to be in control. And finally, another issue under food sovereignty is the fact that even if you don't want to eat genetically modified foods, you are still eating genetically modified foods, because pollen from genetically modified plants blows in the wind. And you can see that pollen travels very easily in the wind and is accumulated on this car. And pollen will blow into other fields of neighboring farmers and pollinate their plants. And they will pass on their genetically modified characteristics to plants in nature. And, you know, plants, genetically modified pollen could blow into an organic farmer's farm and pollinate the organic foods, and those organic foods could then become tainted with genetically modified traits. So there is no such thing as being absolutely certain that you're not eating genetically modified foods if you don't want to be eating them. You don't have much control over that. So that was an overview of food sovereignty. Okay, well, that was my presentation on genetically modified foods, and if you have any questions, please feel free to comment on the video and I will do my best to answer them. And here is a list of my sources.